The morning mist clung to the Colorado mountains like a reluctant goodbye, slowly releasing its grip on the small town of Silent Valley as the sun climbed higher. Mayor Arthur Brennan stood at his office window, his grey eyes fixed on the weathered wooden cross that crowned Memorial Hill, the highest point overlooking their isolated community of barely 2,000 souls. For 37 years, that cross had stood there, battered by mountain storms and bleached by unforgiving summers, a monument erected by the town's founders after the devastating flood of 1987 that had claimed 43 lives and nearly erased Silent Valley from the map. Arthur's jaw tightened as he watched the morning light catch the rough grain of the old timber. To most residents, the Guardian of the Valley, as they called it, represented hope, resilience, and shared history. To Arthur, it was a daily reminder of unanswered prayers and the crushing silence that had followed his desperate pleas 6 years ago when leukemia had stolen his 8-year-old daughter Lily, despite all his bargaining with heaven at the foot of that very cross. His secretary, Margaret, knocked softly before entering with his morning coffee. She'd worked for 3 mayors before him and had perfected the art of reading the room. Today, she sensed the storm brewing behind Arthur's composed exterior. "The city council meeting is at 10, she reminded him gently, setting the steaming mug on his desk. "The renovation proposal for Memorial Hill is on the agenda." Arthur turned from the window, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Thank you, Margaret. Please ensure all council members received the updated documentation about the liability issues and the structural assessment." He had spent months building his case, couching his personal vendetta in the language of progress and public safety. The cross, he would argue, was deteriorating, posed liability risks, and violated the principle of separation between church and state in a public space. Silent Valley needed to modernize, to attract new businesses and young families. The old monuments of tragedy needed to make way for symbols of progress. The council chamber filled slowly that morning, the worn wooden benches creaking under the weight of concerned citizens. Word had spread through the valley like wildfire that something significant was on the agenda. Sarah Chen, who ran the local bakery, sat next to Tom Martinez, whose grandfather had helped erect the cross. Behind them, the Johnsons, recent arrivals from Denver seeking small-town peace, whispered nervously. The atmosphere was thick with the kind of tension that precedes mountain thunderstorms. When Arthur presented his proposal, his voice was steady, clinical. He cited insurance premiums, legal precedents from similar cases in Boulder and Fort Collins, and presented architects' renderings of a modern memorial garden that could replace the cross. "We're not erasing history," he insisted, his hands gripping the podium. "We're reimagining it for a diverse, inclusive future. The Memorial Garden will honor all victims of the 1987 flood, regardless of faith." The explosion of voices was immediate. Tom Martinez stood, his weathered face flushed with anger. "That cross isn't just wood and nails, Arthur. It's the heart of this valley. My grandfather's hands bled building it. When my son came back from Afghanistan missing a leg, he climbed that hill on crutches just to sit beneath it." Sarah Chen's voice cracked as she added, "During the pandemic, when we couldn't gather, we'd look up at that cross and know we weren't alone. You're not removing a religious symbol, you're tearing out our soul." Arthur listened to each objection, his expression unchanging, though inside every word was a dagger. They didn't understand. They couldn't see past their sentimental attachment to recognize that some symbols become monuments to pain rather than hope. When the vote was called, it split 5-4 in favor of removal, with Arthur casting the deciding vote as mayor. The silence that followed was deafening. Half the room erupted in protest, while the other half sat in stunned disbelief. As the crowd dispersed, Arthur remained seated, feeling the weight of what he'd set in motion. Through the chamber windows, the cross stood unchanged against the afternoon sky, but he knew its days were numbered. Margaret approached him quietly. "The removal is scheduled for next Monday," she said softly. "Weber Construction won the bid." Arthur nodded, not trusting his voice. Outside, the town that had always moved in harmony now walked in fractured groups, neighbors avoiding eye contact, friends choosing different sides of the street. Silent Valley had never felt less unified. Monday arrived with unseasonable warmth for October, the kind of day that made the mountains shimmer like mirages. Jake Weber and his crew arrived at Memorial Hill before dawn, their heavy equipment rumbling through the sleeping town like reluctant thunder. Jake had driven up from Colorado Springs specifically for this job, knowing it would pay well, but feeling increasingly uneasy as his convoy climbed the winding road to the hill's summit. He'd removed plenty of structures in his 20-year career, but something about this job sat wrong in his stomach, though he couldn't articulate why. The first sign of trouble came as they positioned the crane. The engine, meticulously maintained and inspected just days before, sputtered and died. Jake's mechanic, Bruno, a man who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, spent an hour checking every component. "Everything's perfect," he muttered, bewildered. "But she won't turn over. It's like the battery's dead, but it's reading full charge." They tried jump-starting it, switching batteries, even bringing up a backup generator. Nothing worked. The massive crane sat silent, defying all logic and mechanical knowledge. By noon, a small crowd had gathered at the hill's base. Some came to protest, others out of curiosity, and a few, like Councilmember Patricia Hayes, who had voted for removal to ensure the job was completed. Arthur remained in his office, watching from his window, refusing to give the impression that he was personally overseeing the removal. But his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee, and Margaret noticed he'd barely touched the lunch she'd brought him. Jake decided to try a different approach, bringing in a smaller excavator to at least begin loosening the cross's concrete foundation. This machine started fine, giving everyone a moment of relief. But as soon as the bucket touched the ground near the cross, the hydraulics failed catastrophically, fluid spraying everywhere like mechanical blood. Bruno stood back, shaking his head. "In 20 years, I've never seen hydraulics fail like that without warning. No pressure loss, no worn seals, just complete system failure." The crowd below began to murmur. Some saw divine intervention, others suspected sabotage. Rebecca Torres, a nurse at the local clinic and a woman of deep faith, fell to her knees and began to pray. Her teenage son, Miguel, embarrassed, tried to pull her up, but she remained firm. "Can't you feel it?" she asked those around her. "Something's different here. The air itself feels alive." Most dismissed her words, but Jake's crew exchanged nervous glances. They'd all felt it too, a strange electricity in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. As the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Jake made one final attempt. They would use hand tools, old-fashioned manual labor. 6 men approached the cross with sledgehammers and pry bars, determined to at least make some progress to justify their day's pay. But as they raised their tools, something extraordinary happened. A sound, barely audible at first, began to emanate from the wood itself. Not a creak or groan, but something almost musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The men froze, tools suspended mid-swing. Young Sam Morrison, the newest member of Jake's crew, later swore he heard voices in that sound, whispers in languages he didn't understand, but somehow felt in his bones. He dropped his hammer and stepped back, his face pale. "I can't," he said simply. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I can't." One by one, the other men lowered their tools. Jake, frustrated and confused, grabbed a sledgehammer himself and approached the cross. As he raised it overhead, ready to strike, a gust of wind, impossibly strong and focused, knocked him backward. The sky had been still all day, not a cloud in sight, yet that wind had been real as stone. By evening, Jake Weber was packing up his equipment, defeated and disturbed. He found Arthur in his office, preparing to leave for the day. "I don't know what to tell you, Mayor," Jake said, his usual confidence shattered. "I've never walked away from a job, but this isn't normal. That cross doesn't want to come down." Arthur's face darkened. "Crosses don't want anything, Mr. Weber. They're wood and nails." But even as he said it, Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Jake left without another word, his check uncashed, his crew already halfway back to Colorado Springs, eager to put distance between themselves and whatever they'd encountered on Memorial Hill. That night, Arthur stood at his bedroom window, looking up at the cross silhouetted against the star-filled sky. For the first time in years, he thought he could almost hear Lily's laughter carried on the wind. He shook his head, attributing it to stress and exhaustion. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of his daughter picking wildflowers on Memorial Hill, placing them at the foot of the cross, and turning to him with eyes full of forgiveness he didn't deserve. Tuesday night descended on Silent Valley with an unusual stillness, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The failed removal attempt had divided the town even further, with some viewing it as a sign and others demanding Arthur bring in out-of-state contractors. But at 9:47 p.m., something happened that made everyone stop arguing. A soft, pale light began to emanate from the cross on Memorial Hill, visible from every corner of the valley. It wasn't bright or harsh, but gentle, like moonlight through fog, though the moon that night was new and the sky was clear. Marcus Thompson, the sheriff's deputy on night patrol, was the first to radio it in. "We've got some kind of light situation up on Memorial Hill," he reported, his voice uncertain. "Might be kids with flashlights or... I honestly don't know what I'm looking at." Within minutes, phones across the valley began buzzing as neighbors called neighbors, and families stepped out onto their porches to witness the phenomenon. The light didn't flicker or pulse. It simply glowed with a steady, almost breathing rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the valley itself. Arthur received the call from Sheriff Davis while reviewing budget projections in his home office. "Arthur, you need to see this," Davis said, his usually steady voice carrying an edge of bewilderment. "The whole town's watching. If this is some kind of stunt—" Arthur cut him off. "I'll be right there." He grabbed his coat, his mind racing through rational explanations, hidden LED lights, phosphorescent paint, some elaborate hoax by the opposition. But as he stepped outside and saw the gentle luminescence bathing the hill, his rational arguments crumbled like old parchment. Within an hour, hundreds had gathered at the base of Memorial Hill. Sarah Chen brought thermoses of coffee and hot chocolate from her bakery. The Johnson family sat on a blanket, their young children pointing in wonder. Even Dr. Samuel Ross, the town's most vocal atheist and Arthur's supporter in the removal vote, stood transfixed, muttering about atmospheric phenomena and electromagnetic fields, though his scientific explanations sounded increasingly desperate. Then the experiences began. Maria Gonzalez, whose husband had died in a construction accident 3 years prior, suddenly gasped and clutched her daughter's hand. "I smell his cologne," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Old Spice and sawdust, just like always." Her daughter, initially skeptical, then noticed it too. Within minutes, similar reports rippled through the crowd. People were experiencing sensory memories of lost loved ones. The sound of a grandmother's humming, the feeling of a father's hand on a shoulder, the taste of a mother's secret recipe apple pie that hadn't been made since her passing. Arthur stood apart from the crowd, his fists clenched in his pockets. This was mass hysteria, he told himself, collective delusion brought on by stress and suggestion. But then he smelled it too. Lavender and vanilla, the exact scent of the lotion his wife Emily used to use, though she'd been gone 4 years now, taken by the same cancer that would later claim their daughter. His breath caught in his throat as the familiar fragrance enveloped him, so real he turned expecting to see her there. As the night deepened, children began to exhibit unusual behavior. 6-year-old Timothy Hayes, who had never been to Memorial Hill before, began picking small white flowers that shouldn't bloom in October, and certainly not at night. When his mother asked what he was doing, he replied matter-of-factly, "The sad lady asked me to put them by the cross for her daddy." Other children reported similar encounters, describing a young girl in a blue dress who thanked them for helping. Arthur's blood ran cold. Lily's favorite dress had been blue, the one she'd insisted on wearing to the hospital even when it no longer fit properly over the tubes and wires. By midnight, the crowd had grown quiet, each person lost in their own experience. Rebecca Torres had begun documenting the testimonies, her phone recording story after story. The Patterson twins, elderly sisters who hadn't spoken in 5 years over a property dispute, found themselves embracing, both having simultaneously remembered their mother's dying wish that they take care of each other. Tom Martinez sat on the ground, openly weeping as he described hearing his son's voice, telling him he was proud of his father's strength. Arthur couldn't bear it anymore. He pushed through the crowd and began climbing the hill, his breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. Behind him, the townsfolk watched as their mayor ascended toward the glowing cross, his silhouette dark against the pale light. Margaret, who had arrived with her grandson, understood perhaps better than anyone what this meant. She'd seen the grief that Arthur carried like armor, the pain he'd transformed into policy and procedure. "Let him go," she told those who moved to follow. "This is his journey to make." As Arthur climbed, the light seemed to grow warmer, not in temperature, but in feeling, like approaching a hearth after a long winter's journey. His logical mind catalogued possible explanations, even as his heart began to crack under the weight of what he was experiencing. Arthur reached the summit, gasping, not from exertion, but from the effort of holding back 6 years of suppressed grief. The cross stood before him, its weathered wood emanating that impossible gentle light, and for the first time since Lily's death, he allowed himself to truly look at it. Not as a symbol of unanswered prayers or divine indifference, but simply as what it was, a monument built by human hands to commemorate human loss, human resilience, and human hope. The wood bore the scars of decades, carved initials of teenage lovers, burns from lightning strikes, water stains from countless storms. Each mark was a story, a moment when someone had climbed this hill seeking something greater than themselves. He fell to his knees, his pressed suit pants grinding into the dirt, and the dam finally broke. "Why?" he screamed at the cross, his voice raw and primal. "Why did you take her? She was 8 years old. She had her whole life." His fists pounded the ground until they bled, years of contained anguish pouring out like poison from a wound. "I did everything right. I prayed, I believed, I brought her here every Sunday after diagnosis, and you gave me nothing but silence." The light pulsed gently, as if absorbing his pain, neither judging nor responding, simply witnessing. Below, the crowd could hear their mayor's anguish echoing off the mountains. Some wept with him, remembering their own losses. Others prayed, but none climbed the hill. This was Arthur's reckoning, his moment to confront not the cross, but what it represented in his broken heart. Sarah Chen held Rebecca Torres's hand. "He's been carrying this alone for so long," Sarah whispered. Rebecca nodded, understanding that sometimes faith isn't about answers, but about having somewhere to bring our unanswerable questions. Arthur's rage spent itself like a summer storm, leaving him empty and exhausted. As he sat in the dirt, his back against the cross's base, something shifted in the quality of the light. It grew warmer, more golden, and suddenly he wasn't alone. Not in any supernatural sense, but in memory so vivid it felt like presence. He could hear Lily's voice, not speaking to him, but as he remembered it, singing off-key in the car, asking endless questions about why birds flew south, laughing at his terrible dad jokes. The memories came not as torment, but as gift, each one a reminder that grief is love, with nowhere to go. "I wasn't angry at you," he whispered to the cross, though he knew he was really talking to himself. "I was angry at my helplessness. I was angry that love wasn't enough to save her." The truth of it settled into his bones, like coming home after a long journey. The cross hadn't failed him. He had failed to understand that some things are beyond saving. That death is not a failure of faith, but a part of the mystery we all navigate. The cross stood not as a promise that tragedy wouldn't come, but as a testament that humans could survive it, together. As dawn approached, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, the strange light from the cross began to fade, not dramatically but gently, like a tide receding. Arthur stood, his clothes dirty, his face streaked with tears and dirt. But something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. He looked older but somehow less burdened, like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. The crowd below had thinned, but not disappeared. Die-hard witnesses remained, wrapped in blankets, sharing coffee and stories. As Arthur descended, they parted to let him pass, but he stopped in the middle of them. "The cross stays," he said simply, his voice hoarse but clear. "I was wrong. Not about separation of church and state, not about modernization, but about what that monument means. It's not about religion. It's about us. About Silent Valley, about marking the place where we choose to remember and honor what we've lost and what we've survived." Tom Martinez stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Welcome back, son," he said quietly. Sarah Chen pressed a thermos of coffee into his hands. Dr. Ross cleared his throat. "I still don't believe in the supernatural," he announced to no one in particular, "but I believe in whatever happened here tonight." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd, the kind that comes when tension breaks and healing begins. Over the following weeks, Silent Valley slowly knitted itself back together. The cross remained, now officially designated as a historical landmark. A small plaque was added at its base, reading simply, "In memory of all who have been lost and all who remain. Silent Valley remembers." Arthur returned to his duties as mayor, but something had changed. He smiled more, listened longer, and every Sunday morning, early before the town woke, he could be seen climbing Memorial Hill, not to pray but to remember, to sit in the presence of his grief and his love, and to watch the sunrise paint the valley in light that needed no explanation beyond its simple beauty. The strange events of that night were never fully explained. Scientists came from Denver and found no unusual electromagnetic readings. Psychologists wrote papers about mass grief processing, but for the people of Silent Valley, explanation mattered less than experience. They had witnessed something together, something that reminded them that the most profound mysteries aren't about what we can prove, but about what we can share. The cross stood as it always had, weathered and scarred, a silent guardian, not of divine intervention, but of human resilience, of the courage it takes to remain open to wonder, even when our hearts have been broken by loss. And in that small Colorado valley, surrounded by mountains that had seen countless sunrises and sunsets, the people continued their lives, a little more tender with each other, a little more aware of the preciousness of what they had, and what they had lost, and what they had found in the losing.